And for us to say it, who obviously have a vested interest, is one thing. But when an independent referee comes in, sight unseen, examines the field, commits a year and a half of his life to trying to write what he views, in his own words, as the potential for the most egregious crime in the history of science. And said document is then delivered to NASA, to the program scientist, Dr. Bevan French, for the Mars Observer Project, and 36 hours later, the Mars Observer spacecraft simply disappears. One does begin to wonder if there is a problem. And if the problem goes back to this document, the Brookings document, which warned that finding artifacts or intelligence out there might conceivably endanger the future of civilization. Well, one of the things that McDaniel did in his report was to verify that our methodology seems to be pretty sound. We seem to be asking the right questions. We seem to be arriving at provisional answers through the appropriate mainstream methodologies of science. It's the kind of thing that obviously we could not have created. We had to wait for Stan McDaniel to basically put his shoulder to the wheel and do the independent work and discover that we in fact are doing what we should. Part of what we have been trying to do is to decode the meaning of the geometry, the meaning of the math involved in the relationships between those monuments. And one of the funny things that we have found, one of the absolutely unexpected things that we now think we have discovered and we're dying to get on with figuring out, is the possibility of a whole new physics decoded in this geometry and math. A physics which can successfully do everything from predict the latitudes of the major active centers on the sun. That string of brilliant lights in the northern and southern hemisphere of the sun, which are plages in the chromosphere and intensely heated regions in the corona just above the surface of the sun, shown in this false color X-ray view, those group along two key latitudes, which you're going to hear some more of later on this evening. 19.5 degrees north and south. As we pursued this idea of a physics, one of the things that came up over and over again was that the math and geometry between these objects on Mars was capable of predicting the positions of the most active energetic upwellings in planets all across the solar system. In 1989, when the Voyager 2 mission flew by Neptune, a couple weeks before the encounter, before we had photographs this stunning, before the actual determination of the latitude of the great dark spot of Neptune had been accomplished, one of my colleagues in our project, Errol Torren at Defense Mapping, and I published a paper electronically on the CompuServe information network. And we did it deliberately because we wanted to have on the record, before NASA announced it, our prediction of the latitude of the great dark spot and the magnetic polarity of Neptune based on our provisional understanding of this physics that we believed we were decoding. And we were successful. The great dark spot is at 19.5 south. And the magnetic field of Neptune is opposite the Earth's, although to a greater extent than we had thought at the time. What is important is that this is part of a trend. The great red spot, this vast vortex which is swirling around and around and around in the southern hemisphere of Jupiter, the great red spot, like the great dark spot on Neptune, the great red spot of Jupiter is, you guessed it, at 19.5 south. And we now believe we understand, because it seems that these huge cyclonic upwellings are part of an energy system contained within the planet which is obeying these new laws that we believe we're in the process of decoding and understanding and exploring. And the positioning of these vast vortices in a coordinate system which is tetrahedral. That is, if you put a tetrahedron in a sphere, where the points touch the sphere is where the energy upwellings will come up. And so far, we have not found an exception across the entire solar system to this prediction. And if you know anything about the Popperian model for science, you know that science is nothing if it's not specific numerical prediction. Well, we were able to extend the predictions to Io. Let's go back one. You notice there are two little glowing dots, one here and one over here. This is Europa, one of the inner moons of Jupiter, and this is Io. They're both about the size of Earth's moon. Now, Jupiter, on the other hand, is something like 10 times the size of Earth, 1,300 times the volume of the Earth. So these little moons are really, on this scale, moonlets, little grains of sand orbiting a giant, as opposed to our own moon, which we'll get to. I promise you, we will get to our own moon. Why is this important? Because on Io, signified by these brilliant bluish plumes, which are caused by little tiny particles scattering sunlight so that the plumes of volcanic emission appear blue for the same reason that the sky appears blue, because of what's called Rayleigh scattering of light. What Voyager found as it flew by in both the Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 mission is that Io has a series of intense volcanic emissions. 7 or 8 active volcanoes. Volcanoes that are so dramatic and so active and so violent compared to terrestrial standards that Io definitely contains the most violent geophysical, or is it iophysical, activity of any body in the solar system. Now there is a standard model which says that this is caused by tides from Jupiter. Well, that's nice, but guess what? That model, which is the mainstream NASA model, cannot explain why the volcanoes are arranged on Io in terms of latitudes that conform to higher levels of the tetrahedral geometry and math. And our proposal, our explanation, very simply, can. A segue for the placement of these geophysical processes is the fact that on Io there is a lot of energy coming up in a very violent fashion. One of the implications of the pursuit of this new physics is that we have discovered a virtually unlimited pollutionless energy resource, if you can find a way to harness it. The energy is coming, and I'm not going to describe the details of this because you can see it if you look at the UN briefing, or you can see it if you read the book. But the energy now appears to be coming from a higher dimensional set of space, n spaces. That is, n-dimensional sets, 4 space, 5 space, 6 and above, which are co-sharing this room with us even now, but are invisible because literally they are in another dimension. What the physics seems to be showing us is that there is a mechanism, a natural mechanism in our familiar 3-dimensional existence for tapping higher energy realms of hyperdimensional physics. And if you can tap those, if you can provide a conduit so that the energy will cascade downhill, heat flows from hot to cold, it never goes from cold to hot. If you can set up the proper conditions so the energy flows into our familiar 3 dimensions, what you discover is that worlds such as little Io will literally turn themselves inside out in a few million years, spewing prodigious amounts of energy into space over and over and over again. Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, the 4 giant planets of the solar system, have been known since the 1960s to all be radiating more energy out than they are getting from any known or modeled source. Jupiter is radiating about 1.7 times more energy, Saturn about 1.8, Uranus about 1.2, and Neptune a whopping 2.7 to 3 times more energy coming out than is flowing in from the sun itself. And you can't get around it by saying, oh, there's radioactive stuff going on in there, or oh, the planet is shrinking, or oh, the helium is dripping, or any of the models that are out there, because it turns out when you look at the numbers that those models simply don't really work. As Ross Perot has said, and I'm going to repeat a couple times tonight as I show you the details, the devil is in the details.